5 men go up to the courthouse stairs in Granite, Colorado, while court is in session, and before the room can even settle into what is happening, they open fire on the judge at the bench. Not out in the street, not out on some lonely trail, not in an ambush at night. No, they do it in his own courtroom. And that right there is how this one starts. And that is why it's going to stick, because there is something especially cold about a man being murdered right where the law is supposed to live. And Judge Elias Dyer was not some loud, swaggering, fool out looking for a fight. No, he was trying to hold a line in a place where that line was already breaking. So by the time that they killed him in Granite, and this happened in early July of 1875, there's some dispute about whether it was the 2nd or the 4th, but the whole country around him was already sour with hatred and revenge and the kind of frontier anger that just stops caring about truth and starts caring only about sides. And to understand why they murdered him, you have to back up a little into that poison that was already in the ground. This thing started with a dispute between 2 men, okay? So you had Elijah Gibbs and George Harrington over land and water. And that might sound small to us now, right? Just some property fight in the mountains, but in the mining country back then, okay, water was not a side issue. Water was life. Water was power. Water was control. You mess with a man's access to it, you're not just insulting him. I mean, you're threatening his whole future. So this fight grows. Tension rises. Buildings actually get burned. And then George Harrington gets killed. And once that happened, the whole thing just changed shape. It was no longer just a feud, okay? It was a killing. And suspicion dropped hard onto Elijah Gibbs. He and his ranch hand, who was Stuart McClish, got arrested. And because the whole area was already boiling over, the case ended up getting moved to Denver. And then Gibbs was acquitted. Now, that should have been the end of it, right? In a lawful world. It was not the end of it there. It just made all the people involved madder. I mean, much more angry. And that is the thing about these old mountain places, right? People like to imagine, rough justice is something half noble and half colorful. It was not, ever. Most of the time, it was just rage dressed up as principle. The court says one thing, the crowd says another, and once the crowd decides the court failed, you guys, that's when things get dangerous. So Gibbs comes back, and vigilantes, well, they decide they're going to finish what they think the law failed to do. Well, they go after him at his cabin, and they try to burn him out. They try to trap him and try to end it their own way. But Gibbs, he gets out, and in the fight, he kills 2 of the men coming after him. And later, that was treated as self-defense. But by then, it barely mattered. Nobody was really weighing clean facts anymore. The whole country had just split open. And at that point, people were not asking about, hey, what is true, okay? They were asking, well, whose side are you on? And right in the middle of all that stood Judge Elias Dyer. Now, that is where this starts to get heavy, because Dyer, he wouldn't go with the mob, okay? He was the son of Father John Dyer, and he was an old circuit riding preacher that people still remembered up in the mountains. And Elias Dyer, he seems to have had some of that same, backbone in him. He believed that Gibbs was innocent, or at least not proven guilty the way the mob wanted him to be. And in a place like Granite, at a time like that, that was enough to mark him. One account says that vigilantes, they actually confronted him on his way to court, and they demanded to know straight out whether he thought that Gibbs was guilty. And he said no, or at least not the way that they wanted him to say yes. And that answer turned him from judge into an obstacle. And they told him to resign, and told him to get out, told him to, leave the county. And for a little while, he did pull back, right? He went to Denver. He actually tried to get help, and he tried to get support from, the territorial authorities at that time. He was trying to bring some actual, weight of government back into places that he was already slipping out of lawful hands. But meaningful help never really came. And that part right there feels familiar in a bad way. A man in office, he knows the danger is real. He asks for backing. The backing never really arrives. And then he has to go back anyways. So Dyer, he goes back to Granite. And, I keep getting stuck on that because, that is the part that tells you who he was, right? He comes back into a place where the air is already wrong, where people they're already choosing force over law, where witnesses are scared, where threats are just hanging around like wood smoke, and he still tries to do his job. He actually started issuing warrants at that time, and he starts trying to move the machinery of law again. Well, one account says that he did 16 arrest warrants. Think about that. I mean, he is trying to, put names on the violence, trying to force the districts to look at what it has become. And by then, people are just scared stiff, okay? The witnesses do not want to testify. Nobody wants to be the man who stands up in the wrong room and says the wrong name while the wrong men are listening. So the courtroom, just fills with tension. And you could feel it, right? People just watching. People waiting. Nobody's saying what needs to actually be said. And Dyer knows it is closing in on him. In a letter remembered later, he basically made it plain that he feared he might not live through it, and that line tied to him later, the one carved into memory, says it all. I die for law, order, and principle. Because that's not a man talking big. That is a man who knows exactly where he is standing. So there he is in court, in Granite. He's trying to move things forward in a place where law is just hanging by a thread. And when the witnesses they won't come through, the proceedings begin to fall apart. Maybe dismissed, right? Maybe postponed, depending on the exact account. But either way, the moment breaks. And then, almost immediately, the killers move. 5 men go up the stairs into the courthouse. They walk into the courtroom. And there they shoot Judge Elias Dyer where he sits. That is the image. That one, that's the one right there that doesn't leave, right? Not a judge found dead on the roadside. Not some body out in the brush, right? A judge killed at the bench in front of his own town because in that moment, the town, or at least the armed men inside of it, had decided that the law was no longer really in charge. And nobody ever paid for it. That is the part that makes this feel so cold all of these years later. The killers, they were never clearly identified, never convicted, never made to answer for what they did. So the whole thing just sits there in history like a wound that never closed right. And I think that is why I think this one hits harder than stories 10 times more famous, because this is not just frontier violence. This is frontier violence walking into a courtroom and putting bullets into the idea of law itself. Granite was the perfect place for something like that to happen. Small, isolated, mining country, tense, important enough to matter and raw enough that once fear and revenge took hold, well, there was not much left standing between public order and private force. People want old places like that to feel rough, but honorable. And sometimes they were just rough. Sometimes they were so raw that if a judge would not bend, they killed him where he sat, and then let the mountains keep the silence afterward. In the aftermath, it only makes it sadder. So you had Father John Dyer, right? He's shattered by the loss of his son, and later accounts say Elias was eventually moved from Granite to the family plot over in Castle Rock. I should probably go look at that and see if I can find that. And that line stayed with him, right? The one about law, order, and principle, because it explains the whole story better than any neat summary ever could, right? He was not murdered because of some random quarrel. He was murdered because he stood for a rule the mob had already decided to replace with its own. And that is a darker kind of history. That is the kind that, gets buried under the much prettier versions of the West. People talk about mining Colorado, and they think about ore carts and mountain camps and fortune saloons and hard men just chasing silver and gold. But this is in there too. A courtroom, a judge, a room full of fear, 5 men on the stairs, and a town finding out in the ugliest possible way what happens when revenge gets stronger than the law. So tell me what you think. Was Elias Dyer murdered because one side had completely given up on justice? Or was Granite already so poisoned by fear and faction that his death was just final proof the county had slipped out of lawful hands? Well, if you guys like Colorado mining history with the blood still in it, right, and the grudges still on it, and the stories buried underneath the postcard version of the mountains, well, please subscribe and stick with me, because there are a lot more ghosts like this hiding in these hills. So don't forget, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you on the next one.